The sun was a heavy, molten weight pressing down on the scorched plains of West Texas, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked earth. Mary walked with a slow, rhythmic gait, her boots stirring up clouds of fine, red dust that seemed to coat everything in a layer of weariness. She had been walking for 3 days since the last town, her only possessions tucked into a small, weathered satchel that hung heavily against her hip. Her throat was a desert of its own, parched and tight, and the vast horizon offered little more than the shimmering heat of the afternoon. As she crested a small rise, she saw it. A ranch that looked as though it were slowly being reclaimed by the land itself. The fences were leaning at precarious angles, the wood grayed and splintered by decades of unforgiving weather. It was a place that breathed a stagnant air, a place where the pulse of life had slowed to a desperate, uneven thrum. As Mary approached the gate, the rusted hinges let out a mournful shriek that pierced the silence. She paused, her heart hammering a nervous rhythm against her ribs, but she didn't turn back. She had nowhere else to go. Moving toward the main house, she noticed the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of things left undone. The porch steps groaned under her weight, and that was when she saw him. Andrew was standing in the shadows of the doorway, holding a small baby who was twisting and fussing in his arms. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with a deep, bruised exhaustion that went far beyond the physical toll of farm work. His shirt was stained, and his hair was a wild mess of salt and pepper, sticking up in different directions as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration for hours. Beside the chicken coop, a young girl named Lily stood watching the stranger. She was about 7 years old, but her eyes held the guarded, suspicious hardness of someone much older. She didn't move, didn't wave. She simply stared, her small jaw set in a line of silent defiance. The air between them felt thick with unspoken grief, and the smell of dry hay and old wood. Mary took a shallow breath, trying to steady her voice. She didn't want to seem like a threat, just a human soul in search of a moment's mercy. She looked at the man, then at the crying infant, and then at the cold, dark windows of the kitchen. She knew this look. It was the look of a house that had lost its heart, a home where the fire had gone out a long time ago, leaving only the ashes of what used to be. "Sir, please," Mary began, her voice raspy from the dust and the long miles. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Andrew looked at her, his gaze flickering from her dusty boots to her tired face. He didn't answer immediately, his mind seemingly miles away, perhaps lost in the memory of a time when guests were welcomed with a smile rather than a wary stare. The baby let out a sharp, piercing wail, and Andrew winced, shifting the child from one arm to the other with a clumsy, desperate sort of love. He looked at the kitchen behind him, then back at Mary. He seemed to recognize a similar kind of exhaustion in her eyes, a shared language of the weary. "Yes, of course," Andrew finally muttered, his voice a low rumble. "Come on in, but the well is still good, even if nothing else around here is." He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the dim interior of the house. Mary stepped over the threshold, and the sudden coolness of the shade felt like a physical weight lifting off her shoulders. But as her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw the reality of the situation. The kitchen was a disaster of unwashed plates, empty tins, and a cold iron stove that looked like it hadn't seen a flame in days. There was no smell of bread, no hint of a simmering stew, just the metallic scent of old grease and the pervasive smell of dust. It was a house in mourning, a house that was starving for more than just food. Mary looked at the baby, whose face was flushed a bright, angry red from crying. She looked at Lily, who had followed her inside and was now leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The girl's eyes were like flint, sparks of anger hiding a deep, terrifying well of loneliness. Mary felt a sudden, sharp pang of clarity. She knew she couldn't just drink her water and walk back out into the heat. There was a gravity to this place that pulled at her, a sense of shared brokenness that she couldn't ignore. She turned to Andrew, who was now patting the baby's back with a rhythm that was far too fast, his face a mask of mounting panic. "If you let me stay the night," Mary said, her voice gaining a new, steady strength, "I can make the dinner. I can fix this kitchen." She didn't wait for him to agree. She moved toward the sink, her hands already reaching for a discarded cloth. Andrew froze, his eyes wide with surprise, and he looked at the stranger who had just walked into his chaos and offered him the one thing he couldn't find for himself: a way forward. He looked at the baby, then at Lily, and finally at Mary. The silence stretched between them for a long, heavy minute, broken only by the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Andrew gave a single, slow nod, his shoulders dropping an inch, as if some invisible burden had been shifted. "All right," he whispered. "You can stay." The first thing Mary did was reclaim the stove. It was a massive cast-iron beast that sat in the corner like a forgotten monument. She knelt before it, her fingers tracing the cold metal, feeling the history of 1,000 meals that had once warmed this room. She found a pile of dry kindling in a box by the back door and began to layer it carefully, her movements precise and deliberate. She didn't rush. She knew that a fire built in haste was easily extinguished. With a single match, she coaxed a small, flickering orange tongue of flame from the wood. It danced for a moment, precarious and fragile, before catching a larger piece of cedar. Soon, the kitchen was filled with the soft, rhythmic snapping of burning wood, a sound that felt like the first heartbeat of a body returning to life. As the stove began to radiate a gentle, steady heat, Mary turned her attention to the rest of the room. She found a bucket of water and began to scrub the wooden table, her movements strong and sure. The layers of grime and neglect began to peel away, revealing the beautiful, a honey-colored grain of the oak beneath. Lily watched her from the shadows of the hallway, her expression a mixture of fascination and deep-seated resentment. Every time Mary moved a chair or wiped a counter, it was a reminder that the world was changing, and for a child who had lost everything, change was a terrifying thing. Mary didn't try to force a conversation. She simply worked, her presence a quiet, constant hum of activity that slowly began to push back the gloom of the house. She found a bag of flour in the pantry, a few wrinkled potatoes in a bin, and a jar of salted pork. It wasn't much, but to a woman who had spent years making something out of nothing, it was a feast waiting to happen. She began to peel the potatoes, the long, curling skins falling into a pile like shavings of gold. She moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, her hands knowing exactly where to go and what to do. The sound of her knife against the cutting board, thump, 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 created a new tempo for the house, one that countered the frantic, uneven cries of the baby. Andrew sat at the freshly cleaned table, the infant finally quieted in his arms, his eyes fixed on Mary, as if he were watching a miracle unfold in real time. The scent of roasting pork and simmering potatoes began to drift through the house, snaking its way into the dusty corners and up the stairs. It was a warm, savory aroma that promised comfort and safety. It was the smell of a mother's kitchen, a smell that had been absent from this ranch for 2 long years. Andrew closed his eyes and took a deep breath, his chest expanding fully for the first time in months. He could feel the tension in his neck beginning to dissolve, replaced by a strange, fluttering hope. He hadn't realized how much the coldness of the house had been eating away at him until the warmth of the stove started to fight it back. He looked at Mary, who was now stirring a pot of gravy, her face glowing in the firelight. It smells like home," Andrew said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He seemed almost afraid to say it out loud, as if the words might break the spell and return them to the darkness. Mary looked over her shoulder and gave him a small, tired smile. She didn't say that she was just doing what needed to be done. She knew that for him, it was so much more. She saw the way his hands were shaking slightly as he held the baby, and she realized that this man was on the very edge of a total collapse. He wasn't just tired, he was drowning. And in that moment, she realized that by saving this kitchen, she might be saving his entire world. When dinner was finally ready, Mary set the table with the few pieces of mismatched china she had found and cleaned. She placed a bowl of steaming stew in the center, the steam rising in white, ethereal ribbons toward the ceiling. She gestured for Andrew to sit, and even called out softly to Lily, who was still hovering in the doorway like a ghost. The girl hesitated, her hunger clearly warring with her pride, before she finally shuffled to the table and slid into a chair. She looked at the food with wide, disbelieving eyes. It had been so long since she had seen a meal that wasn't served straight from a cold can or a burnt pan. She took a small bite, her eyes fluttering shut as the rich, savory flavors exploded on her tongue. The meal was eaten in a silence that was entirely different from the one Mary had encountered upon her arrival. This wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of deep, soulful appreciation. The only sounds were the clinking of spoons against bowls and the occasional soft coo from the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully in a small basket near the stove. Andrew ate with a ferocity that spoke of a deep physical hunger, but also a spiritual one. He looked at Mary across the table, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, a silent pact was made. She had brought light into his darkness, and in return, he would give her the one thing she lacked: a place to belong. As the moon rose over the Texas plains, casting a silver glow across the ranch, Mary finished cleaning the last of the dishes. The kitchen was sparkling now, the iron stove still humming with a lingering warmth. Andrew had shown her to a small spare room off the back of the house, a room that had once been used for storage, but was now swept clean and ready for her. As she lay down on the simple cot, the smell of the cedar fire still clinging to her clothes, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was no longer a drifter. She was a woman with a purpose. And as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that the real work, the work of mending a broken family, was only just beginning. The following weeks were a whirlwind of quiet, steady labor. Mary didn't wait for instructions. She saw what needed to be done, and she did it. By 6 o'clock every morning, the smell of fresh coffee and griddle cakes was already winding its way through the hallways. She had found an old garden plot behind the house that had been overgrown with weeds and brambles, and she spent her afternoons on her hands and knees, pulling out the invaders and preparing the soil for new life. She found seeds in the back of a cupboard, tomatoes, peppers, and beans, and planted them with a prayer for rain. Every day, she carried heavy buckets of water from the well to the garden, her muscles aching, but her heart feeling lighter with every green sprout that dared to poke through the red dirt. Lily, however, remained a fortress of solitude. The young girl was a shadow that followed Mary from room to room, watching her every move with a sharp, judgmental eye. If Mary baked bread, Lily would refuse to eat the crust. And if Mary folded the laundry into neat, square piles, Lily would purposefully toss them onto the floor. It was a quiet war of attrition, a test of Mary's patience and resolve. Mary understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the girl's anger wasn't directed at her, but at the hole in her heart where her mother used to be. Mary didn't scold her, nor did she try to buy her affection with sweets or empty promises. She simply continued to be there, as constant and reliable as the rising sun. One Tuesday afternoon, as the temperature climbed toward 90 degrees, Mary was hanging the wash on the line. The white sheets snapped in the wind like the sails of a ship. Lily was sitting on the porch steps, drawing patterns in the dust with a stick. Mary walked over and sat down a few feet away, her own clothes damp with sweat. She didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the horizon where the heat waves shimmered over the distant hills. "My mother used to say that the wind in Texas tells stories if you listen long enough," Mary said softly, not looking at the girl. Lily paused her drawing, her stick hovering over the dirt, but she didn't look up. She said, "If you hear a whistle, it's a secret. If you hear a roar, it's a warning." Lily's shoulders tensed, but she didn't pull away. "My mom didn't care about the wind," the girl whispered, her voice so low Mary almost missed it. "She cared about the rain. She was always waiting for the rain so the dust would stop coming inside." It was the first time Lily had mentioned her mother to Mary, and the words felt like a tiny, fragile gift. Mary nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of that memory. "So dust is a stubborn thing," Mary agreed, "but a good rain can wash away almost anything, given enough time." They sat in silence for a while longer, two souls tethered by loss and the harsh beauty of the land, before Lily stood up and walked back into the house without another word. It wasn't a victory, but it was a beginning. Inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted from one of despair to one of cautious optimism. The baby, whom they called Arthur, was thriving under Mary's care. He was no longer the colicky, miserable infant he had been. He was now a bright-eyed boy who laughed when Mary sang old folk songs to him. Andrew noticed the change most of all. He was spending more time in the fields, his strength returning as his mind was freed from the constant worry of his children's survival. He would come home to a clean house, on a warm meal, and the sound of laughter, a sound he had thought was gone forever. He began to repair the broken fences and paint the weathered trim of the house, his actions reflecting the restoration happening within his own soul. However, the world outside the ranch was not as welcoming as the one Mary was building inside. Rumors began to circulate in the nearby town of Abilene. People whispered in the general store and outside the church about the strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere and moved into Andrew's house. They talked about propriety and the memory of Andrew's late wife, Sarah, who had been a pillar of the community. They didn't see the clean floors or the thriving garden. They only saw a woman who didn't fit their narrow definition of how things should be done. Andrew felt the coldness of their stares when he went into town for supplies, a growing pressure that he tried to ignore, but could feel pressing against the edges of his newfound peace. One evening, a neighbor named Mrs. Sarah, named after Andrew's late wife, which only added to the tension, stopped by with a basket of unwanted advice disguised as muffins. She stood on the porch, her eyes darting around the yard, taking in the neat garden and the freshly painted shutters. "It's a lot of work for one man to handle, Andrew," she said, her voice dripping with a false, sugary concern. "But people are talking. It's not right, having a woman like that living under your roof without a proper arrangement. It's an insult to Sarah's memory." Andrew's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the porch railing. He looked at the woman, then at the house where Mary was currently rocking Arthur to sleep, and he felt a surge of protective fury he hadn't expected. "The only thing that would be an insult to Sarah's memory," Andrew said, his voice low and dangerous, "is if I let my children starve and my house fall to ruin. Mary has saved this family, and she isn't going anywhere." Mrs. Sarah puffed out her chest, her face turning a mottled pink, before she turned on her heel and marched back to her carriage. She didn't take the muffins with her. Andrew watched her go, a sense of foreboding settling in his chest. He knew that the gossip wouldn't stop there. He knew that the peace he had found was fragile, and that the world had a way of trying to break things that were finally starting to heal. He walked back inside, and the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that felt like a declaration of war. The following Sunday, a visitor arrived who carried more weight than a dozen gossiping neighbors. Edward, a man in his late 60s with skin like cured leather and eyes that had seen every storm Texas could throw at a man, rode up to the ranch on his old bay horse. Edward was the unofficial patriarch of the valley, a man whose word carried the force of law because it was always tempered with wisdom and fairness. He didn't say a word as he dismounted, his joints popping with the effort. He tied his horse to the hitching post and walked up to the porch, where Andrew was waiting for him. Edward took off his wide-brimmed hat and wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief, his gaze lingering on the vibrant green of the tomato plants in the garden. "You've been busy, Andrew," Edward remarked, his voice like the grinding of river stones. Andrew nodded, offering the older man a seat. Mary appeared at the door a moment later, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea and a plate of lemon cookies. She placed them on the small table between the men and gave Edward a respectful nod before retreating back into the house. Edward watched her go, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were trying to read a difficult text. He took a long sip of the tea, then set the glass down with a deliberate click. "She's a hard worker. I'll give her that. The place looks better than it has in 5 years." "She's more than a worker, Edward," Andrew replied, his voice firm. "She's the reason this house is still standing. Oh, she's the reason my kids are healthy." Edward sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire county. "I know that, son. I see it. But you have to understand the town. Catherine has been stirring the pot, telling anyone who will listen that this woman is a drifter looking for an easy life. She's saying you're forgetting your duties to your wife's memory. It's getting ugly. People are talking about calling the sheriff to see if she's wanted for anything." Andrew felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He knew Catherine. She was a woman who fed on the misfortunes of others like a vulture. Andrew stood up and paced the length of the porch, his boots thudding rhythmically on the wood. "I don't care what Catherine says. Mary hasn't asked for a dime. She works from sunrise to sunset, for nothing but a roof and a meal. She loves those kids, Edward. I see it in the way she looks at them." Edward nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I believe you. But you're a man living alone with a young woman. In this part of the world, that's a fire that invites everyone to bring their own matches. You need to think about how to protect her, and how to protect your children's reputation. This can't go on forever like this." The conversation hung over the ranch like a gathering storm cloud. That evening, Mary noticed the change in Andrew's demeanor. He was quiet, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the stove, his dinner mostly untouched. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew. She had seen the way the townspeople looked at her when she occasionally walked to the main road to meet the mail carrier. She knew she was an outsider, a scarlet woman in their eyes, regardless of the truth. She felt a familiar, hollow ache in her chest, the realization that her sanctuary might be temporary. She had spent her life being moved along, told she didn't belong, and the thought of losing this home, this family, felt like a physical blow to her heart. The next day, Catherine herself decided to pay a visit. She arrived in a polished carriage, her dress a stiff, expensive silk that looked entirely out of place in the dusty yard. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped onto the porch, with the authority of an invading general. Lily, who had been playing with a doll Mary had made for her out of scraps of fabric, froze as the woman approached. Catherine looked down at the doll with a sneer of disgust. "Where did you get that rag, child?" she asked, her voice sharp and brittle. "A proper girl shouldn't be playing with trash. Your mother would have never allowed it." Lily's face went pale, her eyes filling with a sudden hot tears as she clutched the doll to her chest. Mary stepped out of the house just as Catherine was about to say more. "She isn't playing with trash," Mary said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "She's playing with a gift made with love, and I think you've said enough to a child who has already lost too much." Catherine turned on Mary, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam. "And who are you to tell me anything? You're a nameless wanderer who has wormed her way into a grieving man's home. You think because you scrub a few floors and cook a few meals that you belong here? You're a scandal, and I will see to it that this town doesn't tolerate your presence a moment longer." The confrontation was interrupted by Andrew, who had heard the raised voices from the barn. He stepped onto the porch, his face set in a mask of cold fury. "Catherine, get off my land," he said, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if he had struck her. "Andrew, I am only trying to help. I am trying to save your reputation." Andrew didn't move an inch. "My reputation is my business. My house is my business. And Mary is my family. If you ever speak to her or my daughter like that again, you'll find out exactly how much I care about what the town thinks. Now leave. And now!" Catherine turned and fled to her carriage, her face a mask of shocked indignation. But as she drove away, the silence she left behind was heavy with the knowledge that the battle had only just begun. The aftermath of Catherine's visit left the house in a state of fragile tension. Lily had retreated into herself again, the mention of her mother like a fresh wound reopened. She sat in the corner of the kitchen, the scrap doll clutched tightly in her lap, her eyes distant and glazed. Mary tried to comfort her, but the girl pushed her away, her grief manifesting as a cold, impenetrable wall. Andrew spent more time outside, his movements hurried and frantic as he worked on the ranch, as if he could outrun the rumors that were spreading through the valley like a wildfire. The atmosphere of the home, which had been so warm and full of life, had once again become chilled by the judgment of the world outside its fences. That night, the baby, Arthur, began to cough. It started as a small, dry sound, barely audible over the wind, but by midnight it had turned into a deep, racking struggle for breath. Mary was by his side in an instant, her heart clenching with the terror she hadn't felt in years. She touched his forehead and found it burning with a fierce, dry heat. She called for Andrew, who came stumbling into the room, his face pale in the dim light of the oil lamp. He looked at his son, whose small chest was heaving with the effort of breathing, and the memories of his wife's final days came rushing back to him with a suffocating force. He froze, his hands shaking, his mind paralyzed by the fear of losing another person he loved. "See, Andrew, listen to me," Mary said, her voice sharp and commanding, snapping him out of his trance. "He has a high fever, and his lungs are congested. We need a doctor, and we need him now. Go to town, find Dr. Samuel, and bring him back here. I'll stay with Arthur. I'll do everything I can." Andrew stared at her for a heartbeat, his eyes searching hers for a sign of hope. He saw only a fierce, unwavering determination. He nodded, grabbed his coat and hat, and ran out into the night. A few minutes later, Mary heard the frantic gallop of his horse as he raced toward Abilene, leaving her alone in the silent house with two terrified children and a sickness that didn't care about their struggles. The hours that followed were a blur of steam and whispered prayers. Mary moved Arthur's cradle into the kitchen and stoked the fire in the stove until the air was thick and moist. She boiled pots of water infused with eucalyptus and mint, creating a makeshift vapor tent over the child to help him breathe. Lily had crept into the kitchen, her eyes wide with terror as she watched her little brother struggle. She saw the sweat pouring down Mary's face as she worked tirelessly, never leaving the baby's side, her voice a low, steady hum of comfort. Lily remembered another night, years ago, when her mother had been the one lying in the bed, and the house had been filled with a similar, heavy silence. "Is he going to die?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely speak. Mary looked at her, her eyes soft with a profound, aching empathy. She reached out a hand, and this time, Lily didn't pull away. The girl collapsed into Mary's arms, her body racked with sobs that had been held back for far too long. "No, sweetheart," Mary promised, her own voice thick with emotion. "We aren't going to let that happen. We're going to fight for him together. You stay here with me. Talk to him. He needs to hear your voice." Lily sat on the floor next to the cradle, holding Arthur's tiny hot hand and whispering stories of the ranch and the garden, while Mary continued her vigil. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the sound of a carriage approached the house at a breakneck speed. Andrew burst through the door, followed by an older man carrying a worn black leather bag. Dr. Samuel didn't waste time with pleasantries. He moved straight to the cradle and began his examination. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the heavy, labored breathing of the child. Mary and Andrew stood back, their hands entwined, a silent support system forged in the fire of a shared crisis. Lily watched from the corner, her eyes fixed on the doctor's face, searching for any sign of a verdict. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Samuel straightened up and wiped his brow. He looked at Mary, then at the pots of simmering water and the steam-filled room. "You did well, woman," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. The steam and the herbs kept his airways open. If you hadn't acted when you did, he wouldn't have made it through the night. The fever is still high, but the lungs are clearer. He's a fighter, this one. Andrew let out a long, shuddering breath and slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands. The relief was so intense, it was almost painful. Mary felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but she stayed on her feet, her eyes never leaving the baby. Dr. Samuel stayed for several hours, administering medicine and monitoring Arthur's progress. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Andrew and Mary, who were standing together on the porch. "He'll need constant care for the next few days, but he's over the hump. You've got a good woman here, Andrew. I don't care what the gossips in town say. Lives were saved in this house tonight. He tipped his hat and drove away, leaving a sense of hard-won peace in his wake. Andrew turned to Mary, his eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it defied words. He saw not just a helper, but the foundation of his entire existence. And in that moment, the opinions of the world outside mattered less than the breath of the child inside. In the days following the crisis, a profound transformation took hold of the ranch. The fear that had once paralyzed them had been replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. Arthur recovered slowly but steadily, his laughter returning to fill the halls like a benediction. Lily had changed the most. The wall she had built around her heart had finally crumbled. She no longer followed Mary with suspicion, but with a desperate, clinging affection. She helped in the garden, learned how to bake bread, and spent hours sitting with Mary on the porch, listening to stories of the world beyond the Texas plains. The three of them had become a unit, a small island of belonging in a sea of uncertainty. Andrew, too, had reached a turning point. He no longer looked at Mary as a temporary arrangement or a fortunate accident. He saw her as the heart of his home, the woman who had walked into his darkness and refused to leave until she had found the light. He knew that the town would continue to talk, that Catherine and her ilk would never truly accept Mary, but he also knew that he didn't care. He had spent too many years living for the ghosts of the past and the expectations of his neighbors. He was ready to live for the people who were standing right in front of him. He began to plan for a future that included Mary, not as a guest, but as a permanent part of their lives. One afternoon, a small delegation from the local church arrived at the ranch. They were led by Pastor Paul, a kind-hearted man who had always tried to stay above the fray of town gossip. With him were two older women from the congregation who had seen the changes Mary had wrought and had decided to judge for themselves. They were greeted not by a scene of scandal, but by a picture of domestic harmony. Mary was in the garden with Lily, teaching her how to identify different types of wildflowers. Andrew was in the barn, his movements steady and confident. The house was clean, the garden was thriving, and the atmosphere was one of peace and hard work. Pastor Paul sat with Andrew on the porch, while the women joined Mary and Lily in the garden. They talked for a long time, not about rumors or reputations, but about the ranch, the children, and the resilience of the human spirit. The women saw the way Lily looked at Mary with adoration, and they saw the quiet, respectful way Andrew spoke of her. They realized that the stories they had heard were nothing more than the bitter imaginings of those who couldn't understand a grace that didn't follow their rules. When they left, they didn't offer advice or warnings. They offered a simple, heartfelt, "God bless you," and a promise to see them at the next town social. The turning point for the community came a few weeks later during the annual Harvest Festival in Abilene. Andrew had decided it was time to stop hiding. He drove the wagon into town with Mary sitting beside him and the children in the back, all of them dressed in their best clothes. As they entered the festival grounds, a hush fell over the crowd. Catherine was there, of course, her eyes narrowed in a cold, expectant stare. But Andrew didn't look at her, and he led his family to the center of the gathering, his head held high. He introduced Mary to everyone he met, not as his housekeeper, but as his partner, the woman who had saved his family. To Catherine's dismay, the town didn't rise up in protest. Instead, many of the people who had been whispering a few weeks ago stepped forward to greet them. They had heard about the night the doctor had been called, and they had heard from Pastor Paul about the peace he had found at the ranch. They saw the way the children were thriving, and they saw the strength in Mary's eyes. One by one, the barriers of prejudice began to melt away, replaced by a grudging respect for a woman who had proven her worth through action rather than words. Mary felt a sense of belonging she had never known, a feeling of being seen for who she truly was, and not just for the labels others tried to place on her. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festival, Andrew took Mary's hand in his. They were standing near the edge of the crowd, watching the children play with their friends. "I don't ever want you to have to walk away again, Mary," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home. These are your children. and I am a man who would be honored to spend the rest of his life showing you how much you mean to us." He didn't need a grand gesture or a fancy speech. The truth was written in the way he looked at her, and in the way the ranch had come back to life. Mary looked at him, her eyes filling with tears of joy, and gave a simple, firm nod. "I'm not going anywhere, Andrew, and I've finally found where I'm supposed to be." The wedding was a simple affair held under the great oak tree on the ranch, the same tree that had once shaded a cold and broken house. Edward stood as Andrew's best man, his leather-tanned face cracking into a rare, genuine smile. Lily served as the flower girl, her dress a vibrant blue that matched the Texas sky, her laughter ringing out across the plains. Pastor Paul performed the ceremony, his words a celebration of second chances and the enduring power of love. The entire community had turned out, including some who had once been the loudest critics but were now the first to offer their congratulations. Even Catherine was nowhere to be seen, her influence having withered in the face of a truth she couldn't control. After the ceremony, as the guests were eating and dancing, Lily approached Mary and handed her a small yellowed piece of paper. "It was my mom's," the girl whispered, her eyes shining with a newfound peace. "It's the recipe for her favorite bread. She said it was a secret, but I think you should have it now." Mary took the paper, her fingers trembling as she touched the delicate script. It was more than just a recipe. It was a passing of the torch, an acceptance that Mary was now the keeper of the home's heart. She pulled Lily into a tight embrace, the two of them standing together in the warm afternoon sun, a family bound not just by blood, but by choice and shared survival. The years that followed were filled with the steady, quiet rhythm of a life well lived. The ranch flourished, becoming one of the most successful in the valley. But the real success was the home they had built within its walls. Mary and Andrew faced many more challenges, droughts, storms, and the inevitable heartaches of raising children. But they faced them together, their bond strengthened by the knowledge of what they had overcome. Arthur grew into a strong, kind-hearted young man, and Lily became a woman of great wisdom and compassion, always remembering the woman who had walked out of the dust and changed everything. The story of the strange woman became a legend in the valley, a reminder that grace can be found in the most unexpected places. As Mary grew older, she often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She would look at the thriving garden, the sturdy fences, and the laughter of her grandchildren playing in the yard, and then she would think back to that first day she had walked up the drive. She realized then that she hadn't just saved Andrew's family. They had saved her. They had given her a reason to stop running, a place to plant her roots, and a love that had healed the wounds of her past. She had learned that a home isn't just a building. It's a collection of moments, a fire that must be tended with patience and care, and a sanctuary where even the most weary soul can find rest. In the twilight of her life, as she watched the stars begin to twinkle over the vast Texas landscape, Mary often reflected on the profound lessons her journey had taught her. She understood now that life is a tapestry woven from threads of both sorrow and joy, and that the beauty of the final design often depends on how we handle the frayed edges and the broken pieces. She saw that the most important thing a person can do is to keep their heart open, even when the world seems determined to shut it. For an older person, someone who has walked many miles and seen many seasons change, the true measure of a life is not found in the things we have accumulated, but in the lives we have touched and the love we have left behind. She had learned that family is not always something you are born into. Sometimes it is something you have to build, stone by stone and meal by meal. It is a choice we make every day, to show up, to listen, and to care, even when it's difficult. True healing, she realized, doesn't mean forgetting the past or pretending the pain never happened. It means learning to live with the scars, allowing them to become part of your story rather than the whole of it. It is the ability to look at a broken kitchen and see a feast, to look at a grieving child and see a future, and to look at a stranger and see a sister or a mother. It is the quiet, persistent work of turning theirs and mine into ours. As she felt the coolness of the evening air on her skin, she thought about the importance of simple things: a glass of water, a warm stove, a shared meal. We often spend our lives searching for grand gestures and miraculous interventions, but the real miracles are usually found in the small, everyday acts of kindness. A word of encouragement to a struggling neighbor, a hand held during a fevered night, a recipe shared with a new friend. These are the things that truly sustain us, and they are the stitches that hold the fabric of a community together, the small fires that keep the cold at bay. For those of us who have lived long enough to see the world change many times over, these simple truths are the only ones that remain constant. She knew that the legacy she was leaving behind wasn't the ranch or the garden, but the sense of belonging she had fostered in her children and grandchildren. She had taught them that no one is truly a stranger if you look at them with empathy, and that no house is beyond saving if you are willing to bring the light. She had shown them that grace is a gift we must be willing to both give and receive, and that the greatest strength is found in vulnerability. As she closed her eyes, listening to the soft rustle of the wind in the oak tree, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had walked a long, dusty road, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all, that no matter how far we wander or how lost we feel, there is always a way home, provided we are brave enough to knock on the door and ask for a glass of water. The shadows grew longer, and the house behind her began to glow with the soft, warm light of the evening lamps. She could hear the voices of her family inside, the clinking of plates, and the easy, familiar laughter that had become the soundtrack of her life. She took one last look at the horizon, where the red dust of Texas met the deep blue of the approaching night, and she smiled. She was no longer the tired traveler with nothing but a satchel of memories. She was a woman who had built a world, a woman who had found her fire and kept it burning for all those who needed its warmth. And as she stood up to join her family for dinner, she knew that the story she had written with her life would continue to be told long after the sun had set on her final day.